Welcome to the fourth episode of Let's Talk Science. My name is Stephanie Monticelli, and I'm Program Director at Humans for Education. And I'm joined by Daphne Pariser, CEO and founder of Humans for Education. And today we're going to talk a little bit about mental health and COVID-19.
And so we're really excited to introduce our guest here, Bibi. She is coming all the way from Nairobi, Kenya today to talk to us. And Bibi is specializing in trauma experiences, and she's a therapist out in Kenya. And she has studied psychology and psychosocial medicine, and she's been trained in many different styles of therapy. She also has 2 graduate degrees, one in psychology and one in social sciences. So we're really excited to get her take on the mental health during this COVID crisis. So thank you so much for being here with us, Bibi.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Daphne and Stephanie. Really appreciate it.
So before we get started, we just want to tell everybody a little bit about what we're doing. So Humans for Education is doing these podcasts so that we can raise a little bit of awareness for the feeding programs that we have out in Kenya. So the people in Kenya have more or less not been able to work for the past few months, and so they are relying on outside help for food right now. And so we are funding over 1,000 people for basically $45 for 1 month feeds a family of 7. So if you guys have any ability to do that, please go to humansforeducation.org/COVID-19. And if anybody still needs masks, we also have partnered with Mansaware, so please go to our website to get those masks. So Stephanie, let's ask our first question.
So let's start just kind of generally. So how is COVID-19 impacting people's mental health around the world in general?
Well, first of all, it's so great that you're asking about mental health because COVID-19 has really thrown many people into uncertainty about their jobs. As you said, people in Kenya have not worked for a couple of months, some of them. Especially in informal sectors. There's fear of financial insecurity and the future state of the world. I think these are also very global themes. And for people with pre-existing or chronic mental health conditions, the circumstances that COVID-19 has brought, like lockdown restrictions in their respective country, physical and social distancing, they're worsening, and anxiety and depressive symptoms and increasing feelings of isolation and loneliness. And then on the other side, when you look at the cultural trauma or lack of social support during traumatic events, or missing out on weddings, on funerals, on religious gatherings, this has been extremely tough, especially for people in Africa or people in South America and across the Islamic world, for whom this is also very important religious time. And these gatherings are their main source of community. By the time COVID had any impact in Africa, we've been following the developments in Europe very intently, and we're bracing ourselves for the same disease picture consisting of anxiety, loneliness, depression. So the main difference between that picture of having anxiety, depression, loneliness that you would very much have in the developed world and what we have in the developing world is that the virus here is divisive along socioeconomic lines, which means that the middle class and the upper class are just affected the same way that you would know and by loneliness and anxiety and depression, whereas the lower class is thinking about, well, do I go out and expose myself to the virus or do I starve to death? And while this sounds extreme, it is actually that dire in very many African countries, or generally countries in the developing world. So people are operating on very different levels of the needs hierarchy. And the gap increases the feelings of insecurity and carries through between members of society and in relation to the government. There's just a lot of distrust because it's very hard to have faith in someone guiding you through COVID if the advice they're giving you is wash your hands regularly, wear a mask, stay at home, but you don't have running water, you don't have a mask, and you don't have a home. So it lowers overall compliance and it increases anxiety. And unfortunately, most of those suffering from mental illnesses cannot afford the support they need and they lack the forum to get help. But even the ones who can could very quickly feel overwhelmed. There's an example of a German minister who ended his life after becoming increasingly worried over how to cope with the economic fallout of COVID. Mm-hmm. So mental health is a very universal struggle, and the World Health Organization has published on mental health, but it just lacks socioeconomic specificity. So, for instance, I wrote down that one of these quotes, let me see, it says, to healthcare workers, take care of yourself at this time. Try and use helpful coping strategies such as ensuring sufficient rest and respite during work or between shifts. Now, they wrote this in March, and by May, this looks absolutely ridiculous because people in Milan, Madrid, Tehran, New York, or other very strongly affected cities, the healthcare workers would have loved to have a break, but it's just not possible. Mm-hmm. So it seems that many countries have stated that it is important to ensure mental health during this time, but there doesn't seem to be a strategy or a budget for it, and that just leaves a lot of people hanging. So it's a broad brush, but I hope
Yeah.
So I think sometimes we think about mental health as kind of a short-term problem, like COVID is causing you to kind of feel down, or that you don't have a lot of resources, but really it's a long-term issue. So what are some of the long-term implications of your mental health and having poor mental health? How can that affect you for many years?
And I want to just add to that, because COVID is going to be here for a long time. So I think taking that into consideration as well.
So it's a two-parter. So the first part is just why your mental health matters. Mm-hmm. And mental health matters because, much like any other injury or wound, if you don't tend to it quickly, the longer you wait to treat it, the longer it takes to treat it. So letting major concerns about your mental health go, letting it slide, or thinking it's not that important, it can cause certain patterns of thinking about yourself or about the world to gain currency in your mind. Mm-hmm. And if the mind is overwhelmed by uncertainty for such a long time, the concern is that we get locked into this chronic pattern of sympathetic nervous system dominance. So I know your audience is scientifically inclined, but I'll just say what I mean by that is that it means that that the branch of your nervous system that is in charge of fight or flight is activated and firing at a more constant rate than usual, while your resting and digesting nervous system is relegated. This means that your physical well-being is negatively affected by the wellness in your mind. And this is a very basic connection that a lot of people tend to ignore, because constant stress leads to this sympathetic dominance, and that means that with time, the health system will be overwhelmed on so many different levels just because you let the mental health of someone slide. You'll have higher blood pressure, lower immunity, higher blood sugar. So what started off as watching the news a little bit too much or scrolling through social media too much, all of a sudden leads to this massively affected immune system, and that in turn, again, impacts your mental health. So for just generally on a strategic level for governments to say, well, we're more focused on the economy right now, is a massive oversight, because if you have 52% of your workforce not able to return to work, you'll have a very different problem than the one that you started with. Mm-hmm. And those are some of the numbers. So for instance, in Africa, about 50% of people around Africa have been diagnosed with depression, cannot get any treatment. Mm-hmm. So with COVID, these numbers rising and more people ending up in these very troubled situations and not being able to return to work, what's the point of getting the economy back or getting factories working if no one will go back to them? So if I was going to advise on a strategic level, I would say, well, let's go out and see what the most pressing issues are. And we don't need to send people through grad school and give them PhDs. But for now, let's just see where we can help out people in a very specific kind of intervention.
Mm-hmm. So what about on like an individual, when we're talking about strategy, just person to person, like peer-to-peer. What can people do just as human beings and not even as a government or as an organization do to help people deal with, mental health, especially because it is very stigmatized. You don't always know that people are having problems. What can we do to kind of help people, even though we might not necessarily know that they're struggling with mental health issues?
Be nice, be kind. I think everyone feels like they're going through the same thing right now, but we're not all going through the same thing. We're all in this world that's going through COVID, but we're responding to it in very different ways. Of course, there are clinical conditions that need the attention of a therapist, and you're not going to get around that. But there are a lot of symptoms that can be attributed to the dissolution of routines or livelihoods that can just benefit from a quick intervention, which can be a phone call from a friend. It can be just calling a support hotline. For instance, in Kenya, there are support hotlines for mental health. There's free counseling from the Red Cross. There are organizations that are cold calling vulnerable people to see if they can help them. And you'll find this across many different countries. And the other thing would be that now this is something that's also very culturally specific, but there's this woman, Aster Almedon, who wrote in a journal about human resilience, and she said that people have to be able to articulate it in their own language. So, for example, in Tigrinya, there is this word that's called sanat. It's a 4-letter word in Tigrinya, just spelled with 4 letters, not in a bad way. It is a very multidimensional word because it evokes mental, emotional, spiritual insight, social. It's very specific to its communal social context. So in a lot of different countries, it would be about finding that word because it encompasses a psychosocial construct that only a member of that culture and linguistic group can respond to. And so maybe we can remove ourselves from thinking that we have to call it therapy, we have to call it therapist. We can use any word that we want that is specific to the culture that we're in, and then respond to that. So if someone in the Tigrinya-speaking environment asks someone for its sanat, they would know exactly what it means. It would mean, I need you to pray for me, I need you to hold my hand, I need you to support me through this thing that I'm going through. I'm overwhelmed. That's what it means. And in this same way, it's about, as a person, finding what it is within your culture that makes out this construct of support and then just leaning into it.
I love that. So what do you think is your biggest concern about mental health during this crisis now and also as it continues down the road?
Wow.
Where to start, right?
Where to start? Wow. Okay. So, other than, again, I'm just going to keep on repeating this because this is so universal. So, other than your fear, anxiety, and depression, I've observed a lot of financial anxiety. In Kenya, there have been reports of panic attacks and breakdowns, as well as one confirmed case of suicide in quarantine facilities. So people have been hiding their positive COVID results to avoid stigmatization. It's almost like HIV in the early days. So the pandemic has been very severe on people whose psychological ailments make it so much harder to adapt to new routines or to stay at home. Those with pre-existing psychological ailments such as personality disorders or anxiety disorders, people with OCD have been very severely affected and triggered by this, by the calls to hygiene. People with mood disorders. So the aftermath worries me because COVID has robbed many people of the chance to grieve, to share in mourning, to partake in cultural rites, and they've been left alone with their own grief, their own fears in confronting potentially their own death, potentially losing a loved one, and just other psychological discomforts. So this decline of cultural social practices that guides people through traumatic experiences and the lack thereof can catch up with people, and I don't think we know yet in which form.
So you talk a little bit about stigma. So how do we help start destigmatizing not just our mental health, but you talked a little bit about COVID itself. How do we destigmatize having COVID and along with that mental health issues to help try and make some of this a little better?
Destigmatizing. Now, whether COVID will make a difference, I do not know. Some 5 years ago, at the bigger outbreak of Ebola, people have been in contact with the disease or with infected people were later found to have PTSD and depression. It did not change much in increasing mental health services or acceptance thereof. So sensitizing the population to mental health and creating more spaces and acceptance for the mentally ill, that would be the first step. And then secondly, research should be conducted on mental health issues within different cultural contexts. So a lot of the research that we go with is quite old, very much based on Europe or based on America or just based on a cultural context that people don't really identify with or potentially even agree with, or they'll disagree on principle to practice based on it because it's not theirs. Thirdly, we could get more locally trained mental health practitioners. And the necessity for that is, for instance, in South Africa, which has a population of over 50 million, there are only 10 graduates in clinical and counseling psychology per year. And that's a surprisingly low number. Now, I've been educated in Europe, and that's where I've spent most of my life. So I might feel strongly about how to approach mental health challenges, and might have specialized in this and that form of therapy over many years. But what setting works within a specific culture? Who am I to say this is how we destigmatize something, or this is how we gain cultural acceptance of a certain form of therapy? We just need to be very humble and patient as practitioners and be culturally responsive and translate our role as therapists to the cultural context. Many people are not so opposed to therapists if they're not called therapists, if they're called village support or whatever word it is that is different from just therapist and Western sounding and just foreign and not part of the cultural acceptance. So while I hope that COVID brings about some change in this regard, we're still quite far away.
And tell us again, you're one of about 60 therapists in all of Kenya, is that right?
Yes, although again, there are very huge differences in that as well, because looking for a therapist in a community that is this tight-knit and this skeptical towards psychotherapy, it doesn't really matter how many you have. It's about whether there's an established confidence in the process.
Right.
So even if people have the financial means to go to therapy and they know where to find one, and that therapist tells them that they've got space for them, there is no established trust in the confidentiality, and people are very careful when they inquire about therapy, thinking, well, but what would people say? Or what if they find out that I'm not coping with things on my own? What will this mean for my business? What shame will this bring onto my family? So there are a lot of different dimensions to consider. It's not just the access. If we had 2,000 therapists in Nairobi, it wouldn't make much of a difference. People just wouldn't go.
But that's a very interesting point that you bring up, especially about the whole stigma of therapy. Is it's very personal, and there is a lot of emotional decision behind making that choice, which is exactly why we wanted to do this mental health podcast today. So I know that we're wrapping up here, so I would love to just ask you, I know that this is kind of putting mental health in this very not great box, but do you have any tips, tricks, resources for people who can't afford therapy, who are on their own right now, just trying to get through COVID?
Well, there are ways to just stay somewhat sane in the confines of your apartment. So I think I've said this is you have clinical conditions and you have very strong, overwhelming, potentially feelings where you do need professional help. And in that case, you look for it because it is there. So you have mental health hotlines. You've got, if you have access to a computer or to the internet, you can find these numbers, or you can call the Red Cross in most countries. They'll be able to direct you. So that is the one side that I really just want to stress. And then on the other side, you, have heard this probably several times about having a routine and trying to maintain that. Generally, just many days just flow from one to the next without any separation. Try to create an event from which you can say, oh, that was a week before we had the big dance party, or it was a week before the storytelling time, or it was on storytelling day. In societies that have a rich oral tradition, it can be very useful to transfer that knowledge, and you don't really need anything except for a room and sitting down to transfer some knowledge and experiences, share some traditions and family history. So these are things you can do without any means more than if you have a voice. If you're working from home, put on some clothes, pretend to go to the office, even if you're just getting dressed in your bedroom and carrying your little briefcase or your purse with your lip balm or your tissues from your bedroom to the dining room, or to, if you live in a studio, from the one corner of your studio to the other corner of it, Just create some kind of separation, because clothes are uniform. And sitting within the same chair, whether you're wearing a suit or whether you're in your PJs or naked, you will feel different sitting in that chair. So create that for yourself. If you don't have a support network, find one. There are personality traits that are more reclusive, that respond better to digital communication and connection. If that is you, then do that. Otherwise, try the Zooms, the Google Hangouts, WhatsApp chats, or yell at your neighbors from the window if you live close enough, or from the door. You can have human interaction. It doesn't matter where you live. It's just the means through which you look for it while still maintaining a distance. And then also resting. People think because they're home they're resting, but they're not. So if you would usually get home from work at 5 or 6 p.m., then change into something comfortable at 5 or 6 p.m., or have a glass of water at home, or just do something that separates one part of the day from the other, because you can really create a lot of mental separations even within the confines of a single room. It takes some commitment, but controlling your day is one of the things you can do. And focusing on things that you can do over focusing on things that you can't do is the major thing that will keep you sane no matter what room that you're confined in. And then, of course, sleep is crucial, generally for your general functioning and also for your emotional regulation. If you do not rest your mind and your body, you're more prone to feelings of anxiety, or exhaustion just generally lowers your ability to regulate what you're feeling. And then take a break from media. I've switched off social media for myself. I generally think that you're not that important that people will need to call on you when there are 3 more cases in Bangladesh when you live in Argentina, or when there's 12 more cases in Argentina and you live in Thailand. So if you turn off the notifications, it will lessen that sense of urgency and alarm that a lot of media outlets create in our lives. As an exercise, when you are watching news or when you are consuming any kind of media, just afterwards, just sit down in silence and just acknowledge to yourself how you feel. So just say out loud, say, I feel informed, or I feel afraid, or I feel uneasy, and if you realize that a certain feeling is coming back very many times, then you can look at the source of it. If you're always feeling afraid, you're probably consuming the wrong media, because even in a pandemic, nothing is hold back.
Those are seriously great tips and resources, because I mean, when you think about it, it feels so overwhelming, but when you break it down as simply as you just did, it feels like there is a way through this. It is digestible. We can all do it. And there's very simple pieces that we can all just do at home, no matter where we are, which I love. So I want to thank you so much, Bibi. And before we go, everyone, if you guys are interested in supporting our work, if you like what we're doing, please feel free to support us on humansforeducation.org/COVID19. We are feeding many, many families out in Kenya right now who are really having a very difficult time. So thank you, Bibi, so much for being here. This was an amazing podcast, and we really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I've been able to listen to your podcast, and you do such an amazing job at educating people in a very invested and unemotional way, which is so useful. So thanks for the work that you're doing, for the research that you're putting into this.
Yeah, we really want to make this very fact-driven, because everyone has there's a lot of emotions outside of this anyway. So awesome. Well, thank you guys, and we'll see you next week.